Hello and welcome to Hiring a Good Conversation Designer. Ask me anything. So thank you all for joining us today. We have, as you know, a great panel. We've had questions submitted by attendees beforehand, so they have reviewed it, looked it over, and we will be getting started right now. I'm going to introduce our panelists. And I am Brielle Nikoloff, your moderator. I'm a product manager at Botmock, which is a conversation design tool. So if you ever need any help with your tooling, you can go ahead and check that out. First, we have Sarah Andrew Wilson. Sarah was named an Alexa champion by Amazon and is the Chief Content Officer at Matchbox IO, the award-winning brand behind some of the most popular voice apps on Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, and Samsung Bixby, including Question of the Day, Find My Phone, and Kids Quiz. Oh, I didn't know you were behind Find My Phone, Sarah. That's awesome. At Matchbox IO, Sarah oversees content strategy and communications, creating delightful voice-first experiences for millions of users of all ages in dozens of countries and 4 languages around the world. Sarah previously spent many years in the music industry, working with internationally renowned performing artists and educators. Thanks for joining us today, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me. Hi, everyone.
All right, and next we have Karen Koshansky. Did I say that correctly?
Yep, Koshansky.
Koshansky, okay, thank you. All right, Karen is a senior conversation designer at Google and a longtime veteran of the voice industry. She has spent 25 years designing experiences that are shaping our interactions with the world. Karen's work spans designing conversational interfaces, enterprise chatbots, smart clothing, natural interactions in mixed reality, and experiences for passengers and pedestrians with autonomous vehicles. She has worked for Nuance, Tellme/Microsoft, Jawbone, and Zoox, I think is how you would say that, and has consulted for companies pushing technology boundaries such as Magic Leap and Lego. Karen lives in Basel, Switzerland. Thanks for joining us, Karen.
Hey everyone, glad to be here.
All right, and Celine Oseka, is that correct?
There's lots of ways you can say it, but yeah, I say Osika.
Okay, Celine Oseka.
Yeah.
Celine is a practice lead and senior director of conversational design at 24/7 AI. She has been designing conversational interfaces using emerging technologies like chatbots, AI, natural language, speech recognition, and machine learning for the last 15 years, deploying over 500 conversational interface deployments in the financial, telecommunications, travel, retail, and education industries. With a background in psychology and HCI, human-computer interaction, she currently leads a global team of conversational designers that seeks to design innovative and groundbreaking conversational interfaces. Thanks so much for being here today, Celine.
Thanks, good to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Greg Bennett is a conversation design principal at Salesforce, leading the company's first dedicated department for conversation design since its inception. As a linguist, Greg focuses his work on empowering businesses to create chatbots that feel natural and helpful, build user trust, and meet customer expectations for conversational behavior. Greg works with Salesforce's product teams, customers, and partners to tailor their conversation designs for cross-cultural differences across channels and user populations, as well as how to effectively express personality or conversational style. Thank you for being here today, Greg. All right. And I see some people saying hi in the chat. If you would like to chat in where you're tuning in from today, that'd be great. Like I mentioned earlier, questions were submitted while you registered. So we have a set number of questions already in the deck, but if new questions come up, please feel free to type them into the chat, and the panelists will be happy to interact with you there. All right. We have attendees from all over the world, so thanks so much for joining us today. And just a heads up, this session will be recorded. It will be emailed to you after, later today, most likely. And as we go, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. All right. So, jumping right into the first question, and all of our panelists wanted to answer this one. So Sarah, if you want to start us off with, what skills or experience are you looking for in potential candidates that you are wanting to hire?
Yeah, so thanks, Brielle, and hi, everyone. So as I was talking with our my fellow panelists beforehand, I'm bringing the perspective of a startup to this discussion today. So I'm with Matchbox.io, as Brielle mentioned, and we're a startup. So we don't have any one person who is the conversational designer at Matchbox, but we all kind of work on the process together. So depending on the project, I'll bring in different people who I know will have a very unique perspective that I need. And during the interview process, you know, or when I'm looking at applications and that kind of thing, I really just want to know what someone has done. So I want to know what someone has built and what they are really proud of, and then to walk me through what that process has been. I want to know what problems they've solved. And again, what that decision-making process has been. Most of the folks that we work with at Matchbox are not technical. So we have musicians on our staff. We have brought in, depending on the project, we have brought in school librarians. We have brought in early childhood educators. We have brought in elementary school educators, script writers, audio engineers, all of them we bring together to help us design through the design process. Because if we're working with, say, children, we need folks who know how children's brains work and how a child might respond to certain prompts, and they can help us redirect, and they can help us with that whole design process. So yeah, that's kind of how we do things at Matchbox, and some of the experiences we look for here.
Thanks, Sarah. And one quick thing, Celine, before you go ahead and answer this, I wanted to say, and I apologize, I forgot this at the beginning, but all of our panelists are not necessarily speaking on behalf of their company or their company's hiring practices. They are speaking on behalf of their own experience over the duration of their career. So, Celine, do you want to take on this question?
Yeah, I think what Sarah had said, very applicable to us too. We have had back in our startup days, you know, there was a range of different backgrounds that we got, and there's just the way their brain thinks, right? There's certain elements to that you don't have to have a background in conversation design, because it's not really, hasn't been a established thing for a long time. But yeah, same thing. We've had teachers, we've had video game developers, we've had, there's the obvious like UX designer. There's a lot of applicable skills there. So those kind of skills those help definitely, but it's not, I haven't seen skills that are saying you only have to have conversation design skills. There's so many elements that you can bring to the role that apply, and then that bring different things, right? So, you know, a video game designer is going to have a different line of thinking than a teacher would. So it's really good to have a blend, I feel, of different backgrounds on your team to have that diversity and different line of thinking. But then, it's all about how they think, and if they can process, how they think about the logic and the flows, and they ask the right questions, have that ability to talk with clients about what they need. So yeah, that's I see a lot of similarities in what Sarah had said.
Thanks, Celine. Karen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, great. So to build a little bit on what Celine was saying, I think it's about process. So first of all, user-centered design and the thinking around like how research and usability play into the process. Very detail oriented. So being able to see not just like the happy paths, but be able to kind of know that there's things that we don't know, or be curious and be able to explore. I also think it's really important for the ability to kind of apply past experiences and processes to the future, to new experiences. In a lot of ways, and in a lot of our companies, we're doing this for the first time. And so looking for people who can learn from the past to kind of invent the future. And lastly, I would say I often feel that design and conversation designers are very often kind of in the middle. They're design facilitators in a lot of ways. And so it's about being able to build relationships with all types of people, with engineers and with product managers and so on. So looking for those kinds of skills and experiences.
Thanks, Karen. Greg, what skills or experience are you looking for in potential candidates?
Yes, I just want to echo what Karen said. I completely agree about being at the center of sort of like the center of the wheel of conversation, and all these different spokes are your relationships with other roles. I think it's important to advocate on behalf of the user by drawing from data. What do you know about your users, the target market? How does that inform your language design strategy? I think it's extremely important to stay anchored in who the target audience is of these designs, and what is essentially the target outcome you're hoping to achieve with the interaction. Particularly from my perspective, I'm looking for someone who thinks holistically and descriptively about language, because for me, conversation design is fundamentally about language as the experience. When we think about voice or text in comparison with graphical UI design, for example, now the experience fundamentally is about what you're changing about the language itself. So before, maybe the width of a particular line or a color might have made a difference in, communicating a particular meta message about the website or the graphical UI that, you were using as a user. Now, when it comes to conversation design, it's about, are you changing something in terms of the textuality? So is the utterance ending with an exclamation point or a period? And what does that mean for the interaction? Or are you using a rising intonation at the end of the sentence, or are you not? And what does that mean for the interaction? I think it's important to think descriptively about language rather than prescriptively, whereby you can articulate as a designer why in your text-based chatbot designs, for example, all right should be spelled as one word instead of two words, or maybe as two words, and what's the sort of thinking behind that? Can you actively explain your design thinking behind every aspect of the language in the design? Whether that's, why did you phrase this as a yes/no question? Why does this utterance have to end with an exclamation point? Why are you absolutely, ready to die on the hill of all right as one word? And what does that mean for the user? What does that mean for the interaction?
All right. Question, Karen, should I be looking to hire UX designers, graphic designers, writers? What do you look for?
Yeah, so this is a great follow-on question, right? So of the kind of skills and experiences that we talked about, who has these things, and where should we look? And I would say it's not a slam dunk with anyone who isn't trained in conversation design. I mean, I think one of the big things to consider is the size of your team, and what is the real role of that person. if you need one conversation designer and there are no others on the team, you need, you know, probably someone with more conversation design training than a graphic designer. But I think that, you know, you can definitely look to UX and content writers, playwrights, linguists, UX designers. But I think you have to understand, like, who are they going to learn from? You know, who are their mentors? Where are they going to learn to translate the skills that they have into, like, the conversation design process? So I think you know, it'll depend on the makeup of your team and where folks can learn from. Celine?
I think all of those skills are great to have, but you're always going to have to get an additional skill to be that complete conversation designer. Like, for example, a UX designer we have on our team is wonderful, you know, smart, knows the process, knows everything, but there's the element of, you know, like the language that we might have to add that wasn't really necessarily part of that as much as part of that before. Same thing with the writer is the opposite, right? They're really great with language, can craft that, but in terms of creating the best, you know, simple, you know, they might be a little more flowery in what, you know, how they present their conversation designs, and that might not be the best for the UX, depending on what the situation is. So yeah, there's always elements of every skill set, no matter from what background they think you're going to have to probably train an additional skill set. That's what we've seen anyway. Which again isn't a bad thing. It just means you're having a great blend of backgrounds on your team that all complement each other, and having a lot of opportunity to share those skills and learn from those skills. That's what we find really helpful on our team.
Thanks, Karen and Celine. Great. Sarah, would a candidate with a background in linguistics be a better investment than someone without linguistics knowledge?
Yeah, so it depends on the circumstance and on the project. And if you had asked me this question 6 months ago, I'd say, yeah, it doesn't really matter. But we have recently hired a fantastic employee who has a linguistics background, and she's been invaluable. So we've hired her as a translator and interpreter for different locales, taking our English language content and translating it for other locations and cultures. And she also has a linguistics background, though, and she's been very helpful to us and to the rest of our team in pointing out ways that we can do better. So yeah, so my answer to this is yes, it would be helpful.
Thanks, Sarah. Greg, thoughts on this one?
Sure. I mean, I'm a little biased because my background is in linguistics, but I want to kind of tease apart in the phrasing of the question, background in linguistics and linguistics knowledge. I don't think you necessarily have to have a degree in linguistics to think holistically and descriptively about language. I've had so many friends over the course of my life, and, you know, again, as a former researcher, correlation, causation, can't quite say, but a lot of friends who have, you know, debated the extent to which someone is thinking or strategizing a particular thing with the text messages they send. And I think as a lot more of us are interacting over sort of these digitally mediated channels, such as SMS, we have sort of developed this a little bit more of a muscle around exploring how people communicate additional meaning in language on top of the sort of semantic layer of whatever it is that they're saying. And I think that sort of discourse analytic, conversation analytic skill is something that is extremely valuable. You don't have to be a linguist necessarily or have a degree in linguistics to tell me that, you know, okay, I'm absolutely willing to die on the hill of all right is one word, like Robert said. I think that while it would certainly help, you know, to a certain degree, I think to study it formally, it's not absolutely a mandate. So I'm not, like, from my perspective, I wouldn't mandate, like in my job requirements, that you have to have a degree in linguistics, but rather that you can sort of express knowledge around how to think about language in an analytical way.
Great points. Celine.
Yeah. I guess add on to what everyone is saying. I totally agree. I think we do have some linguists on our team, but you don't have to. I think it is more about understanding the language and how people speak, and not necessarily need to have a degree. Having a degree sometimes can be helpful. It depends on, I guess, what the role is doing. I really like to have the role be holistic and into all elements of conversation design. So not just the design, because there's the whole natural language models and things like that go behind it, that I feel is very important to the design, right? And yes, you might need, potentially, depending on how the structure is, you might need a data scientist to support that, who has that linguist background, but sometimes you won't, right? So if you can, on a platform where you don't need that, the conversation designer starts to take more of that ownership. So having that can be helpful, but like everyone's saying, you don't necessarily think the degree is great, but you don't have to have the degree. We have a lot of folks on our team that understand how language works. And again, the data is important too. Like everyone was saying before, we learn, like Karen, I think, was saying, we learn from the data, right? So if the data is telling me, oh, this is how people speak, this is what people want, that teaches me almost more than a degree could, right? So a lot of it, yes, it's helpful, I think, in some way, understanding language, especially within the geography you're designing for. But really, it's the data helps me learn a lot more about how people are speaking than I would ever know. So.
And Greg, I think what you mentioned as well sort of speaks, it relates to what Sarah said in the earlier question about how if you are designing for children, it may be even if you could only hire one person, it might be better to even hire like a teacher, because they know a little bit more about how children think versus a linguist. But linguists have knowledge about sourcing inclusive data for speech or other things that other people may not have a background in. So thanks for all of your input on this one. Karen, what are some interview questions you ask candidates to gauge the fit?
Yeah, great. Great question. So as I was thinking through this, I kind of came up with 4 buckets of kinds of questions. So definitely there's the industry specific questions. So you need to know kind of, what you need this person to do in the role. So for example, is it conversation design with a multimodal experience? So asking specific pointed questions for designing with multiple inputs like voice and touch in a multimodal environment, right? So if you're designing like international experiences, like, probing around their experience there. So there's industry specific questions. There's process questions. And this is kind of what I was getting at before with what I look for, which is what is their design process. And sometimes you can create sample like design examples and ask them, as crazy as the design is, like, what is that process like? Imagine you are designing a flying car. How would you go about and do that? And just to see if they can apply that process to anything. Asking around kind of the relationships that they've had with team members, with like building that strong rapport with product and engineering. So like what kind of team member they are and their culture. And then I also think it's really important to get a sense of like asking self-reflective questions, things like challenging projects they've worked on, like understanding, how they accept feedback, failed projects, and just how they're able to kind of look at their work and be reflective on their past.
Sarah, what are some interview questions you ask candidates to gauge the fit?
Yeah, so one thing I meant to mention earlier is thinking about the education portion of a resume or an application. I want to point out that is not as important to me, whether you have 3 degrees or no degrees. That's not as important to me as what you've done. what you can do, what you have built, what your experiences have been. Because I know university can be there's a lot of obstacles for many people in actually getting a university degree. So that's okay. I just want to know what you've built, right? So I want to know what you can bring to the table. So in the interview, I try to get people just talking. My interview style is we're just going to have a conversation. I'm not going to ask you any trick questions. I'm not going to ask you what kind of tree, if you could be a tree, what kind of tree would you be? I want to have a conversation. So I want to know, just very straightforward, what interests you in working at Matchbox, starting very broadly, right? And then I want you to tell me about your background. I want to tell you, going back to what you've built, what are you really proud of, and what do you want to be doing, right? And then I want to make sure that in this conversation that you and I are understanding each other, that it's an easy conversation. Because if we're going to be working closely together, on a daily basis, I want to make sure that our rhythm is good. I have a musical background, so I think in rhythm, right? I want to make sure that if we misunderstand each other, that we can kind of get back on track. And also realizing there's a lot that can be trained, but there's also a lot that's kind of inherent to us as individuals. So I want to make sure that we can work together. I can train you on a lot of stuff, but that we're going to be able to work together. Those
Sarah,
are some of the things
can I ask a follow-up question? So you've
Yes.
mentioned a couple times now, you want to know what they have built. When you say that, do you mean have they coded something? Have they created a skill from scratch? Do they have a design portfolio? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So at Matchbox, we focus on voice experiences over voice applications, right, over a smart speaker. So we don't do chatbots or other things. So we really focus on voice applications. So I want to know what voice experiences you have designed. And you don't have to know code. You could use a no-code, platform to build. But I want to know what your process was, and just talk me through how you built it and why you're proud of it, and what you learned from doing it, and what would you do differently in the future. If you haven't built a voice experience, like if I'm talking with a teacher or a librarian or a script writer, it's totally fine. If you haven't if you don't even have a smart speaker, that's fine. Then the conversation is more about how does a child think for working on a children's experience, or what would you do in this circumstance to redirect in the flow, or that kind of thing. So show me something that you've written. If you haven't built a voice experience, show me something else. Show me the script that you've written or something like that.
Yeah, that
Hope
helps.
that makes sense.
All right. Celine, what kinds of information and qualifications should I be including in a conversation design job listing?
And going back and forth in this, before they were called conversation designers, I think we were calling them like interaction designers, and really deciding what to call them. But then, the skill sets were interesting too, right? Because like Sarah was saying, the degree necessarily isn't important to me. It's interesting to see what they have the degree in, and sometimes that will help. But yeah, I don't really even like to list the degree, because it's not, we've had people that don't even have college degrees that have been designers for us, and it depends, right? The skill sets are different, but yeah. So I think the degree, if you did want to put a degree, things like, psychology, computer, anything in like the comp sci background. We talked a lot about all those other backgrounds, right? It could be a degree in anything, but those are great. Like HCI, those are really good foundations, but I don't think required. But the other things, the qualifications are, and it's probably like Sarah was saying, you can flesh out a lot of this more in the interview, and looking at their past work. And what we actually also do is sometimes we'll give them a little sample design. I'll give it's like we did this a lot, and it was really helpful to kind of see like a design a mom and pop pizza shop chatbot, just what it would look like, what it would ask for. And, people that would complete that didn't necessarily, nothing was right. There is no right or wrong, but you could see, this worked, or, you know, this was a great thought process, or this they're not thinking about this right. You know, it's too linear. They're not thinking about all the possibles. You know, things like that, right? It's really easy to see that way. So to me, that's the qualifications I see is kind of post, you know, seeing it after you get their resume in and then talk to them. But yeah, in there, you know, you have things like, you know, logic, speaking skills, like Karen was saying, ability to discern ambiguity. Those are really the qualifications you want to see. It's just really hard to demonstrate that in a resume. You kind of have to demonstrate that outside of a resume.
Thanks, Celine. Greg, what kind of information and qualifications would you include in a conversation design job listing?
That's a great question. I think I agree with Celine and what others have said about degrees. I personally don't think that a degree is necessary, that you can absolutely be a strong critical thinker and a great designer without having a formal degree. That said, I think that if there are those who have degrees, you know, from a college degree at any level, are sort of seeking to transition into conversation design from an academic environment, I would say that if you have a background, say in sociology, linguistics, anthropology, music, or music production in particular, I think that those are really strong backgrounds. English, behavioral psychology, human factors, human-computer interaction, all of those I think really lend themselves quite well to developing skills that make it a particularly salient transition into conversation design. So for those who are students or recently graduated students or have backgrounds in these areas, you know, I would say don't write yourself off or don't hesitate to apply just because you're concerned perhaps that your background isn't like totally or sort of expected as a fit. For example, with music production, there's a conversation designer I know whose name is Ben McCulloch, and he's, I think, based out of the Czech Republic, but his background in music production and sound, I think, really make for a strong conversation designer when it comes to voice. He knows everything about the sound experience, and I'm just dangerous enough having taken a music production class in college as well. So, you know, when I'm talking with engineers about the high and low pass filter and how that could potentially mess with the automated speech recognition system, like, you know, they kind of perk up a little bit. So I would say, like, don't write off your background just because you think that maybe it's overly tilted in one particular area. I think that in terms of other qualifications, I would say, you know, particularly an approach to design and having design strategy experience is really strong. Like others have said, both on the call and in the chat, I think it's important to acknowledge that thinking through the design experience and how that fits into the product lifecycle and having experience in that is extremely important. It's a strong sort of, I think, propensity for how you can connect the design as closely to the user and the target population as possible. So those who have experience in it, I think, are particularly well suited for conversation design. In terms of information I would include in a job listing, I would probably include certainly as many details as I can about, you know, Salesforce and what our values are, what the job itself would entail. So there's, I think, conversation design as it exists as a role potentially means something a little different at different companies. And at Salesforce, I look for conversation designers who are not only able to produce conversation designs and produce the discourse, the information architecture also needed in order to, you know, bring a conversation design to market, to product, but I'm also looking for a conversation designer who has the ability to strategize how we go about sourcing data. So for example, if we're training intents or we are working on, you know, improving our automated speech recognition, that I would want a conversation designer to be able to inform how we go about sourcing those data. How do we make sure that the data sets that we are sourcing are representative, that are diverse, across multiple dimensions, and how do we do so fairly so that way we're not necessarily exploiting these populations that are frequently underrepresented in our data sets. I think a conversation designer, at least at Salesforce, should have a perspective on that, and that is something that I would include in the job description as well.
And Celine. All right, Sarah. What would make a candidate with no experience competitive? I feel like we've already kind of covered this, so we could skip this. What do you think? Do you have any new thoughts on it?
I just want to add one thing to this with this question, which is I don't believe you if you say you have no experience. So you might not have 10 years experience in the workforce on conversation design, but if you're fresh out of university, surely there were projects that you worked on in college where that you could bring that to the table as an example of your work. Or like I said earlier, if you've already built an experience, just kind of as a hobby on your own that you're really proud of, then show that. You don't need, for us at Matchbox, you don't need years and years of professional experience to be really valuable to us.
Yeah, and I think someone in the chat asked a similar question, and a couple of things that come to mind. Self-motivated, right? So this means, today with all the tools that are out there, what have you built yourself? Like you can have these side projects, yourself, build your own skill, build your own action. You don't have to have had a job in order to do this. You can create these projects yourself. So I say, like, what have they done? Even as a self-starter, or even just showing experience with taking things that are out there and showing how you would design it differently, or giving feedback on experiences that exist. So I think that being competitive, if you don't have like a work, the history on your resume, can mean showing that you know what you're doing and you're self-motivated and you want to continue to learn.
Celine, do you want to speak to this one, or do you think? Okay, cool. All right, Greg. If I want to hire a conversation designer, are there cognitive tests like pattern matching to give the interviewee?
I love this question. I think I balk a little bit at cognitive tests. I think that's just a really strong term. And even as a hiring manager, I'd even be intimidated by that, because as, someone who is, for example, my research background means that I also have experience in experiment design, and any experiment design that you create, any task, potentially has bias. And so I wouldn't want to overly bias say a cognitive test for any one particular trait when I'm giving it to a candidate. But in terms of an activity, like types of activities that I might sort of give to a candidate to suss out or better understand their thinking, might be a couple of things. The first of which I would probably say, I do want to double down on what Celine has said. I think that it's absolutely great to discuss how you might design something differently that currently exists on the market. I would say that if you can sort of show a transcript of an interaction that you have or have had with a particular chatbot or voice assistant that's currently on the market, and then show a part of the experience that you think needs changing, and then show maybe what you would design differently about the conversation and anchor it in that transcript, that I think would be a strong exercise. Another exercise I think that would be good would be to sort of walk me through, one of your designs, for example, if you have one, and then, take me through step by step in the interaction. Talk to me about why the language is designed in this particular way, what objective is it supposed to achieve interactionally with the user, and how does the language relate to that? In terms of, I think, other types of exercises that you might give candidates, I would say I've seen writing prompts that have been given where, they'll ask the candidate to, maybe create some utterances or phrases about, or a potential like practice transcript or mock design of what a virtual agent or assistant should do given these particular constraints. I think that that's potentially a helpful activity as well.
All right, Karen, what tools do you expect candidates to be familiar with or proficient at? And this is very timely because we're having this conversation right now in the chat.
There's no, I think, real standard out there for how we document designs. Certainly there's, the tools that are available. I think the most important thing is, and I think a lot of the tools that are out there can kind of translate one to the other. Like, it's okay to document designs in some kind of flow chart if you can kind of take that and use the same kind of flow chart in a different tool. So I'd say I would ask more about the process of how you document and what are those tools, and see if they can then pick up other tools if you have a certain standard at your company that would translate well. I don't think it's, you have to know Figma, you have to know, mind map. Like, a lot of it is transferable.
There's so many tools like every day, and they're generally the same. Like, there's differences and you have to learn the nuances, but I was saying in the chat, they're trainable, right? If you had zero, if you had Excel or something and that's all you had, and PowerPoint, and then you came and you had all the other skills we were talking about being a conversation designer, wouldn't blink an eye at hiring, right? So it's not all of that's trainable, all of it's like Karen was saying, transferable. Yeah, it's not a tooling issue for me. But I did mention in the chat, it's interesting that you may not know the tool, or you may know the tool well, but you still have to know how to communicate how that tool works to other people. Like, sometimes if you don't have a self-serve platform that develops for you and publishes for you, you might have to have a developer that publishes things for you. Or if you request APIs or things like that, you need to know how to use your tools to explain to others what they mean. And so that's, if you're doing it in Visio or, Xmind is another thing we use, all that stuff, you just have to make sure you're very clear in your designs and can communicate that. So that would be the requirement, I think, for the tool you would need, not necessarily the tool itself.
Thanks, Elaine. Greg, do you expect anyone to be familiar with a particular tool?
I am a little biased on this one as well. I mean, I guess I'm biased on all of them. Because Salesforce has its own native bot builder, I wouldn't say that you have to be super proficient in using Einstein Bot Builder to be able to be a strong candidate, but I would expect candidates, particularly for conversation design at Salesforce, to at least have familiarized themselves with the tool. Because I do think that, at least with Einstein Bot Builder, a lot of how the interface and the technology work may potentially be important constraints to consider when you're producing your conversation designs, differently than maybe, say, if you were to use something like, another bot builder that's out there. So I wouldn't say like it's a hard requirement, but I would expect candidates to at least be familiar with. We have plenty of public tools and resources for people to get experience with the Einstein Bot Builder, I guess I would say. There's Trailhead at Salesforce, which is our educational online platform. It's free. You can sign up and you can take a Trailhead on Einstein bots and get experience with the bot builder there. You can go to developer.salesforce.com and get a trial org of Salesforce, a trial instance of Salesforce for 30 days and play around with Einstein Bot Builder using that sort of free version. And those are the kinds of things that I would look for in candidates as they apply at Salesforce. And then also, I just want to double back a little bit and say I might have misattributed some things from Karen to Celine, or perhaps vice versa. And I apologize for that. I think Karen, you might have been the one to say about, differentiating the design, or how would you, what would you change about a conversation design that's on the market currently, or what would you do differently? So I apologize for that.
Thanks, Greg. Karen and Celine, if a follow-up question on this, and if you don't want to answer, just tell me that you pass. But if someone came to you with, say, proficiency in dialogue flow, or a more technical conversation design tool, does that kind of stick out to you in terms of, oh, they might be a great candidate, or does that really not help them clear any kind of, qualification in your mind?
Yeah, to me, that tells me that they've had experience with conversation design before, not necessarily the tool. Again, it's more of, oh, you've done this before and you've thought about it, you've gone through the process. So that might be what I would see from that, not necessarily the tool, but just the fact that they've done it before. That is a bonus to me. Yeah.
Okay.
And some of the tools are a little bit more technical or complicated. So what that tells me is, how to design with certain constraints. There's things that are sometimes can be somewhat cryptic. And so it's like understanding what an entity is, understanding like synonyms and grammars. And like it goes into a little bit more depth of how these tools kind of live on top of the technology. And so it definitely shows to me that you can go deeper. The candidate can go deeper and has more experience than others who are just writing sample dialogues.
Okay, thanks. So it sort of shows that they have an understanding of how conversation design very generally, broadly, is sort of structured. Like, you know what an intent is, you know what a sample utterance is, and that kind of thing. Greg, do you want to add to this?
Everything that Karen and Celine have said, plus one to everything. I think that if I were to add anything, I would say, like, I don't expect them to be proficient at all the tools, but I do expect a candidate to have at least a basic understanding of what's on the market. So, like, what is dialogue flow? What is Einstein Bot Builder? What is Botmock? What is Bot Society? Like, there are a bunch of tools on the market. So at the very least, if they can express that they are familiar with some different tools, and maybe explain which tools, I might ask them, like, okay, so what tools do you use, if any? And if you use tools, why that one? And if you could pick any tool to use for your job, what would it be and why? Just so I can see a little bit more, like Karen said, about their thinking behind tooling and conversation design.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone on this question. All right, Sarah, we haven't heard from you in a minute. Are remote roles going to be more common? Would you hire a remote designer who is based in a different country than you?
Yes. At Matchbox, we have been remote since before the pandemic started. We currently have team members working with us on a daily basis on 4 continents. So we have folks here in the United States, someone in Brazil, a team in the UK, and folks in India. And we have all the tools that we need to make that happen, and we have regular meetings and that kind of thing. So we're used to it, and the answer for us is yes and yes.
Would you mind putting some of the tools you use just generally as a remote team into the chat? I think remote work is a science and an art, so it might be helpful, especially in the context of a conversation design team, if you wanted to share that. Celine.
Yeah, I'll do that too. But yeah, like exactly what Sarah is saying. We had some remote folks before this whole pandemic, but definitely the pandemic changed things, where many of the tech companies are going full remote, right? So it's something you definitely can do remote. Even we have sometimes with clients, we used to have 2-day on-site requirement gathering workshops, right? But that you still can do online. You can do really everything online now with the tools today. But yeah, the key is, I think, it's a lot easier when you're in the office to go to somebody and say, oh, can you look at my design, or just test it with someone in the office or somebody like that. It's a little harder because, you know, they're not in front of you and facing you right then to remind you, oh, can you review my design, right? So there has to be a little bit more proactive reach out there for designers to reach out to clients, to internal folks, to get their, you know, test out their designs, critique their designs. So that's the only thing I think you have to look for in a skill set, is somebody that's willing and wanting to do that and able to accept that feedback. Because yeah, the remote can be challenging for that, but everything else, you know, a lot of the conversations, requirement gathering, development conversations, you know, all of that can happen online. So definitely, I'm a proponent of remote work. I think you get great people across, you know, the broader you look. I do think you know, if you keep yourself to a geography, you're very limited. But yeah, remote is, I hope to be the future of a lot of companies. So yeah.
I worked for Celine remotely for a while, by the way. So, and that worked great, I think. So.
I think so too. Yeah. You were in Switzerland. I'm in Toronto, and I think yeah. The only thing is time zones. You have to make sure that you're conscious of the people that you have in different time zones, and you have kind of core hours that you might meet together with them. Just because you don't want to inconvenience on one side or the other, right? You need to have some common ground for everybody.
Great points. Greg, what about you?
I certainly think remote roles are going to be more common after the pandemic. Salesforce user experience and Salesforce design in particular have always been very remote friendly. I would say that, you know, we've always had designers who have been distributed from all over. One of the first designers I worked with at the company was based out of Toronto, and I'm based out of San Francisco. So I definitely agree with Celine on time zones. We have an office in Tel Aviv. We have offices in Tokyo. We have offices in various different places. And so we have to be very conscious about, okay, if we schedule this meeting at this particular time, are we potentially excluding a whole office because it's in the middle of the night? I have weekly calls or biweekly calls with folks who are on our research team based out of Singapore. And so there'll be times where I'll meet really early in the morning for maybe a colleague of mine in Amsterdam, and then maybe somewhat after 5, my time with a colleague in Singapore. So I would say, you know, for conversation design in particular, I think as we think more holistically and globally about localization, and what that can mean for conversation, I think that I would be certainly looking for conversation designers who are potentially in market and thereby remote. I wouldn't make somebody relocate from France to San Francisco just so I could get their knowledge. In fact, I think it's extremely important that they are in market, because that makes them the closest to the users, the closest to the context, the closest to the market and their needs. And I'd really be looking for someone who is I treat them as a subject matter expert. So I would say that, yes, particularly for global conversation design roles, for other cultures, other markets, other languages, I would very likely hire those as remote roles or based in a different country.
All right. If you want to just take over here, what's the actual name of the role you would post at the top of the job description? What exactly should candidates be searching for?
The name of the role that I've chosen at Salesforce is conversation design. Or conversation designer. I think that it's really, we'll see a bunch of different names out there like AI trainer, conversational copywriter, conversation designer, conversational designer, interaction designer. But at Salesforce, I wanted to make it extremely clear because for our overall UX organization, graphical UX designers, our UX designers are kind of grouped together in a role of product design. And I think that that's sort of taken on a brand at Salesforce around graphical UI design. And I think that in order to kind of differentiate that and make sure that for our practice in conversation design, to distinguish it from graphical UI design, I wanted to make it extremely, I wanted to be extremely intentional about calling it conversation design, so that way folks wouldn't get confused. So conversation design, and then the level. So conversation design senior, conversation design lead, et cetera, would be what you would see at Salesforce. And that's what you should search for.
Again, because conversation, that term has just happened, right? It's, I don't know, in the last like 3-4 years, maybe 3 years. But before, yeah, we were doing conversation design. It just really wasn't branded that, I think, is across the, as a standard. And so many things about conversation design are not standard. Like we were talking about entities before. So many people call those different things, different terms, use them from different ways. So yeah, there's lots of standardization that has to happen across the field because it's very new. But that being said, so we started with interaction designer. I think what Greg was saying, we got a whole bunch of more graphical focused people, right? Which again, it's not necessarily wrong. It's just that's not necessarily they were looking for, and they really like the graphical aspect, and they weren't looking into going just in designing in language. And so the interaction designer part I think was not a great fit. And then I don't know if we saw it or something happened where we started calling it conversation designer, and that's what stuck. It really helped bring in the right resume skill set, and now I would say it's a standard. If you say that, that's what people are going to know. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Celine. All right, we are almost at time. Let's see, how many questions do we have left? Well, we have a few. Okay, so any panelists, if there are questions you see in the deck, you all have your own deck I sent you that you really want to answer, go ahead and type that into the chat, and we'll just continue on with this question with Karen. How and where do you look for talent? And this will likely be the last question that we can do today.
Yep. Over time, there's been the rise of like some great networking opportunities, and all kind of remote. Women in Voice is a big Slack channel and a big group. I mean, LinkedIn, you can find connections, and so I think just posting jobs where the people are has been very valuable, as well as connections and just putting out the word that your company is looking definitely helps. And now we're starting to see more programs like at Career Foundry and other places, like people who go through and get like a conversation design certificate. So I've been looking there.
Sarah, where do you look for talent?
So, what Karen just said about Women in Voice, if you're not familiar with Women in Voice, definitely check them out. It's a really wonderful organization, and we have hired through that organization, and I've discovered some fantastic folks who are a good fit for us through that organization. Also Twitter. I have found some great some people who have become great colleagues on Twitter, and you just follow different people and you're like, I wonder if they'd be interested in working with us. And then also, just to add, what I had mentioned earlier is on a project basis, where we bring in folks who aren't in this industry, but might have a tool set that we really need. So for example, we've been working on a children's voice application involving literacy. So we brought in a elementary school librarian who's nationally respected and worked at the Library of Congress. Again, he knows how children think, and he knows what some of the greatest children's authors, how they write for children. And he's been a wealth of information for us. And likewise, for another children's experience for Kids Quiz, we brought in early childhood educators, because a 5-year-old's brain is very different than a 10-year-old's brain. And we really needed help in redirecting and in understanding how a 5-year-old is going to interact. I want to mention that I keep bringing up children's experiences. They are just a small portion of the Matchbox Matchbox portfolio, but I want to do a shout out to Adva Levin, from the founder and CEO of Pretzel Labs, and she has said that if you can design for children, you can design for adults, because children are far more unpredictable than adults are. Adults often will quickly understand the the structure that you've provided much quicker than children will. So that's why we pull in lots of different people for these experiences with children.
All right, we are 1 minute over, so I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. I'm going to keep my webcam off if panelists want to pop theirs on and just say goodbye. But thank you all attendees for joining us today. I'm so glad that you could be in this conversation. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your time. And someone did ask, will the chat be available? No, it won't, but we will be sending the recording out in an email if you attended. So thank you all, and I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great weekend.
Great. Thanks, everyone.